The main purpose of this application is the ability to create gigs. Employers create gigs and musicians apply to them. To start off, we first need to create the gig model for the database. Each gig has a title, description, offered payment, location, and the ID of the employer that posted the gig itself. This employer ID looks at the ID column from the users table. Let's define this relationship in the user model by adding the gigs property. This property will list all of the gigs created by the employer. Notice that I also added this slug property to the gig model. Slug is a part of a URL that identifies a page in human-readable keywords. We found the correct account based on the username from the URL. For gigs, we could use the ID of the gig, but that is not a really good practice. We can instead use a slug, which will convert the gig title to some useful keywords. To make sure that all of the slugs are different, I will also add few random characters at the end. Since we are using the slug as an identifier, we need it to be unique. To implement this, we need to import two things. First, we need the event object from SQL Alchemy. Event can be used as a decorator, which will listen for some changes in the database. In this case, I want to execute the updateSlug method whenever someone tries to set the gig title property. Pay attention to the indentation, this is defined outside of the gig model. So whenever someone creates a new gig or tries to update the title of the existing gig, this method will be executed. The decorated method takes in 4 parameters. Target is the gig instance that needs to change the title. It is like calling self inside of the class definition. Then we have the new title value and the old value. Finally, the initiator is the event that triggered this method. Whenever this happens, we want to set the slug property of the gig to the slugified value being the new title. After that, we can append the hyphen with the random characters generated by token URL safe. This slugify method is not defined yet, we will import it from the slugify package. So let's write from slugify import slugify. This package needs to be installed, so let's install it with pip. Before we create a migration, let's create one more method inside of the user model to check if the user is the owner of the gig we pass in as a parameter. If it is, the user's ID will be the same as the employer ID foreign key. Okay, now let's create the migration. The message can simply be adding gigs. Upgrade the database and let's go back to the code. The gig blueprint will be similar to the account. Create the same directory structure and define the blueprint inside of the views module. Then we'll register the blueprint with the /gig URL prefix. We'll first define the create view for creating new gigs. User needs to be authenticated and he also needs to be an employer if he wants to create gigs. The view code is the usual get post form workflow. Don't forget to import the functionality that will make this code work, like the required models and the database session. Of course, we need to create this create gig form and also the create gig template. Here we have the main gig form, which has all of the required fields. Create gig form and update gig form will inherit these fields from the gig form. One more thing to note is the price field, which I manually created and defined it up here. If you want to know more about form inheritance and creating custom fields, check out the Flask course on WT Forms. Now let's input these two forms to the views module. We will use the update form soon. The name of the template for this form will be create gig. Now we'll create a view for showing gigs, which will accept a slug as an argument. We can then find the gig with the slug and pass it to the show template. If there is no gig, we will redirect the user to the 404 error page with the abort method. This method needs to be imported from Flask. The show template will be similar to the show account template. If we are the employer that created this gig, then the update and delete gig buttons can be rendered. Since the show view is now over, let's redirect the user to it after the gig creation, instead of redirecting him to the home page. Once the gigs are implemented, we can finally refactor the home page. Remove the user list, we won't need that anymore. If the user is authenticated, we'll include the authenticated partial. If he's not, the landing page will be shown. Inside of this authenticated partial will be the part of the home template for the logged in users. If the current user is an employer, we'll create a button for creating new gigs, and that is it for now. If the user is a musician, we'll render all of the existing gigs on the site. We will loop through all of them and render them with the gig partial. This partial can be created inside of the gigs templates. The partial will be a card element presenting all of the relevant information about the gig. Of course, to show these gigs, we'll need to get them in the home view. If the user is a musician, get all of the gigs from the database. Don't forget to pass them to the template. After refactoring the homepage, we can create the views for editing and deleting gigs. Again, nothing new here. The gig is found with the slug, and we use the update gig form. Delete view is similar to the one from the account blueprint, except this one needs a slug to know which gig to delete. Edit gig template needs to be created. It is almost identical to the create gig HTML. After we do that, we can update the buttons on the show page to point us to the edit and delete view. The delete button is inside of the form, and the update button leads to the edit form. One last thing to add is the list of gigs to the show account page. For now, let's just get all of the gigs if the user account belongs to an employer. We can loop through these gigs inside of the show template. As an employer, I can now create a new gig with this new create gig form. I will input some random data and see if it works. Once the gig is created, we can see the show page of the gig. We can also see it on the employer's account page. Let's also try to edit this gig by giving it a different title. And here we go, the update gig form works. If I log in as a musician, I will see all of the gigs on the home page. If I go to the gig show page, you can notice that I don't have the authorization to edit or delete this gig. However, we have a problem. I created another employer account and logged in. Since this gig doesn't belong to me, I cannot see the buttons here, but I can still access the edit form by just changing the URL manually. This will get me to the gig's edit form even if I'm not the gig's owner. If you take a look at the edit view, you can see that I only need to be authenticated and an employer. There is no authorization based on the owner of the gig, and this is a huge security risk. I will update the gig by stating that I am the owner in the title. And here we go. This should not be allowed.